Good morning for those of you in Europe and good afternoon for those in China. This is Giulia Gallarati, Partnership Coordinator at China-Italy Chamber of Commerce, one of the implementing partners of the EU SME Center. Today's topic is how to tap into China's evolving energy and environment sector, policy, market opportunities, and business strategies. I suppose that the majority of you already knows about the center, but let me give you a short introduction. EU SME Center is a project founded by the European Union, assisting SME to do business in China by providing a comprehensive range of hands-on information, advices, trainings, and other supporting services. The center is implemented by a consortium of 6 partners, and China-Italy Chamber of Commerce is one of the partners who is organizing the webinar today. China-Italy Chamber of Commerce is the association that since 1991 gathers the Italian business community in China. It is recognized by both Italian government, Italian Ministry of Economic Development, and Chinese government, Chinese Ministry of Civil Affairs. And CICC belongs to the Italian institutional network in China. CICC aims to assist and promote its members' activities together with promoting the Made in Italy in China. In 2015, it has about 600 members and in all China, spread in 5 offices, Beijing, Chongqing, Shanghai, Suzhou, and Guangzhou. Let me give you some information about the webinar. So the webinar will last for 1 hour with a short Q&A session in the end. Therefore, I would like to remind you that you can post questions and send us your comment during the webinar through the questions panel on the left of your screen. Our speakers today will try to answer the question as we go along or during the Q&A session at the end. In case your questions are not addressed by the end of the webinar, I will recommend you to register on the EU SME Center website and use Ask the Expert service. Our coordinator will soon send you the link to the website via panel. Now, let me introduce you today's speaker. Our speaker today is Engineer Guido Giacconi. Welcome, Guido.
Thank you, Giulia.
Guido Giacconi is the president of In3 Act, an Italian business strategy and investment advisory firm operating in China since 2006, with key focus on energy, environment, protection sectors. Services are provided to European and Chinese M&S and SME, as well as government bodies. Mr. Giacconi started his career in Procter & Gamble, where he achieved the responsibility of vice president and in several categories in US and Europe. He has worked in many different countries, including US, UK, France, Belgium, Germany, and Italy, and he has been working in China since 2010. Mr. Giacconi has an extensive business strategy consulting experience and worked as a senior partner for companies including Bain Company, Booz Allen, Hamilton, Roland Berger. He is also the CEO of In3 Act Global and GDG and DSRL. Mr. Giacconi received his PhD in bioengineering from Bologna University. He is a lecturer and visiting professor in many universities in Europe and in Tsinghua University in Beijing. I would like to hand over to Guido now.
Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who is in China and who is in Europe. I'd like to talk about this very challenging topic, just showing you what's the challenge China is facing these days about environmental protection and then the relationship with energy. You see here some picture about how is some slice of environment in China. You see a winter sky in Beijing, a landfill where children play, or a sludge field in an abandoned oil field in Xinjiang, or ink released on a channel close to Beijing, etc. And people start to complain a lot about the environment in China. And if till a few years ago people accepted the environmental degradation as a price to be paid for sustaining the economic growth, now that on average people has achieved a fair wealth, people also start complaining about the quality of the environment. It is a political problem, a consensus problem, and a economical problem. So today I'd like to briefly, as far as possible, talk and discuss about the current and prospective economic situation of China. Just providing you the dimension of what we are talking about, starting from economical figures, for then discussing the role of energy in Chinese economy, and then going and share the current and in perspective environmental issues in China. Then I'll provide an overview of what China is doing to tackle the environmental issues, and then discuss which opportunities can be caught by European SMEs within the energy and environmental production sectors. Then we're going to conclude discussing the do's and don'ts in approaching China to get even a thin slice of a huge cake that I'm going to describe later on, and finally to present the conclusions, suggestions, and recommendations.
Thank you, Guido, for your introduction. I would like to ask to the audience our first poll question. So, we would like to know, is your company already operating in China? Please answer yes or no, and we're going to give you some seconds to vote. Some more seconds. Okay. I think we already have the results. Okay. So it seems that the majority of you is already operating in China. So do you have any comment about this result, Guido?
That's good, since yeah, being in China, knowing China could provide a good clue for following what I'm going to talk. But I would like to keep a very balanced information frame for also allowing the friends not already present in China to understanding what's going on in China. And then I hope and expect that during the Q&A sessions, who is in China could put on the table some more specific question about the sector of their interest. So we can start discussing about the overall, briefly as far as possible, economic situation in China, also because I know in Europe and also in China the discussion about where China is going as far as economic situation is concerned is fierce, and there are many different perspectives. I have mine and I would like to share with you. As you know, China GDP has been growing dramatically over the years, albeit growth rate is slowing down. And you see that both the GDP growth and the per capita GDP, we are talking of nominal GDP, is or are slightly declining since 2010, 2011, and last year the official figures talked about 6.7%. We already foresaw that, and we already in 2010 foresaw that the growth, the growth of economic Chinese economy could not afford to keep the pace of 10% as the past decades, and that necessarily the growth would have slowed down according to the achievement of the economic maturity of the country. The recently approved 13th five-year plan confirmed that the objective, the growth objective of the next 5 years is about from 6 to 6.5 and we do agree with these official figures. As you know, China is at the moment officially the second economy in the world in terms of GDP after the USA, and in terms of nominal GDP. Here in this chart you see the red, the minimum maximum Chinese expected GDP in absolute value, while the blue is the USA GDP forecast. And according to many advisors and about our calculation, in about 10 years, 10, 20 years, the nominal Chinese GDP will overcome the US one. If we take instead the purchase parity GDP, either China has already overcome US or is going to overcome US over the next few years. And so this in any case projects China to become the first economy in the world if we take GDP as the right measurement of economy wealth, but we can discuss a lot about that. But let's take the GDP could measure the dimension of an economy. If we go and look at the composition of GDP of China, we do see that over the past 10-15 years, the shares of the three key components of the GDP, I mean the investment, i.e. the gross capital formation, the final consumption expenditure, and the net exports imports of goods has changed significantly. And in 2011, the consumption share has surpassed the investments for the first time over the past 10 years. As of 2010, but it will be more of the next years during the 13th five-year plan, the consumption will assume a more significant role in the GDP formation as a necessity for China for maturing its economy and its GDP structure. This necessarily, together with the service sector that will gain shares, will introduce a dramatic change in the economic structure of China. If we go and see how, compared to the worldwide GDP growth of the past year, China has achieved about a share of 15%. The chart on the left, the gray area is China, and you see how has been the dramatic growth in about 20 years, while the other components, but the rest of the world, I mean the BRICS mainly also has witnessed a significant growth. So saying 15% is not a huge share, but if we see on the right chart, we do see the share of the new GDP that every year China and the other world regions has contributed to. Over the past 3 years, more than 50% of the new GDP created in the world has been accounted by China, and it will continue over the next years. So this provides a perspective of what's the role of China in the world economy and how the Chinese dynamics in the worldwide economy could affect the worldwide industry and economic situation. So in this scenario, talking of China under crisis is not the right perspective. We could say that China is going to transform itself radically, and it will have a huge impact on the energy and environmental protection sectors. So we can conclude this chapter saying that China will continue to grow at a pace of 6.5% a year over the next years, and we do not believe in any hard landing scenario. China will become the first economy over the next 10-20 years. Over the past 3-4 years, China contributed for more than 50% to the new world nominal GDP, with a near increase equal to the total Belgium or Switzerland GDPs. And last, China is facing an astonishing change of growth paradigm, where internal consumption and services will be the key drivers. For a country with 1.4 billion people, this change is what I name the third revolution after the revolution in the 49, after the Deng Xiaoping revolution, and this era of President Xi is going to represent the third revolution from my standpoint.
Thank you, Guido, for your outstanding snapshot of the current and prospective economic situation of China. I would like to ask another question to the audience now. So, which is the sector your company is operating in? Do you belong to the secondary sector or to the tertiary sector? We're gonna give you again some seconds to vote. Let's have a couple of seconds. Okay, we have the result, and let's say the majority of you is in the tertiary sector with 70%, and 30% is in the secondary sector. What do you think, Guido?
So we have, I guess, many either consultants or engineering company or people working in the service sector. That's very good, since China is going towards service to become a service-oriented company. So also in the energy and in environmental protection, there will be significant room for service companies to find a slice in the cake and to develop their own business.
Thank you, Guido. Please go on.
Yeah, so let's enter into the role of energy in the Chinese economy. As probably most of you know, the coal still represents a significant share of the primary energy source in China. At the moment, it accounts about 65% of the primary source, even though the aggregated annual growth of coal is only, let's say, 1%. It means that coal is having a growth much less of the GDP growth. So China is trying to get rid of coal, even though the projection is that over the next 20 years, the shares of coal will remain or will achieve still at 50% of the total. Having a coal of 50% of the coal as a primary energy source means necessarily environmental problems. The positive is that the renewables and the natural gas, together with nuclear, but with some discussion about after the Fukushima accident, are growing significantly. Renewables are growing at 40% growth, average growth in the year. The natural gas about 15%. And so it means that China is pushing towards, let's say, clean energies, trying to balance the damage of having coal as a primary source. If we go and see how the energy consumption in China is structured, we do see that 1/3 of the energy is used to transform the primary energy sources into consumable energy. This is a huge number, since the OECD countries are much more efficient in transforming their primary energy sources. We have the number of some European countries. Italy, for example, consumes about 28%, as well as Germany and France. This means a huge amount of inefficiency. That means a huge amount of primary energy sources that are wasted in the inefficiencies of energy transformation. The industry plays another, let's say, 1/3 in energy consumption, and then the transportation and the other sectors like consumption or other things. The key growth is to be accounted to the transportation. In fact, China is the first market in terms of automotive. But the interesting thing is the huge amount of primary energy sources that in 2014, for example, accounted in 3,000 3,200 million tons of oil equivalent, while the USA, that has a bigger GDP than China, consume only 2,200. For making a comparison, Italy consumes only 150 million tons of oil equivalent. But China is doing a lot for improving its energy efficiency. This chart describes the trend of the energy intensity of some country. The black line is related to China, that in the period, from 1990 to 2000, dramatically improved their energy intensity. And then after the 2000, China continued to improve the energy intensity year by year, but still the energy intensity is double of the OECD country. The red line represents Italy. That is the best in class in the OECD countries for many reasons I'm not going to describe now. It means that would China achieve the same energy intensity of Italy, it could save more than 50% of its energy sources. That means 1,700 million tons of oil equivalent. It means an aggregated figure from 300,000 to 500,000, 300 billion to 500 billion US dollars. So it's a huge amount of money that China could save for being invested in environmental protection and further improving its energy base. And here we have some figure that I would not comment in detail, but both in energy intensity, CO2 emissions, NOx and SOx emission, or water treatment, China performs far worse than the average world, or the other countries have taken Italy, being Italian, as a benchmark, since actually Italy is also is the best in class in terms of CO2 emission, NOx, and water treatment. And in many sectors, let's take the CO2 emissions per GDP, China emits 3 times what Italy emits. If we take the water also, it's about 3-4 times the water that is used per point of GDP. So, concluding very quickly, coal will remain the key primary energy source over the next years, although the natural gas and renewable will play significant roles. China energy system is largely still inefficient, although improving, and energy intensity is still double than OECD countries. Inefficiencies, of course, determines huge costs and dramatic impacts on environment. And now we're going to see how and what's going to be this impact. So, as we already anticipated, the dramatic China economic and demographic growth have determined an increase of inequalities and huge environmental costs. On the left, we have the Gini coefficient growth. The Gini coefficient measures the inequality. The higher the Gini coefficient, the higher the inequalities, and China has increased the inequalities over the years, and more importantly, on the right, the costs introduced by the environmental pollution that has been calculated by World Bank to be about 9% of the gross net income of China. So it's a huge amount of money that China wastes every year for environmental pollution reasons. So the attention to environment is not only a matter of political consensus, but also and mainly because it's a huge economic problem that absorbs resources to be invested in the further growth. As we said, China is the highest CO2 producer and emitter, even though The per capita CO2 emission is far from the OECD country. It means that USA, Europe, OECD countries emit per capita much more CO2 than China. Of course, China is the #1 CO2 emitter because of the size and the dimension of the country, but in terms of contribution per capita is still far from our countries. Would China emit the same quantity of emission per capita than the United States and Europe, it would be really a huge problem. Then we will see what are the commitments of China that China took at the COP21 in Paris and how China intends to contribute to the reduction of CO2 or in general GHG emissions. China has overcome United States in terms of total CO2 emissions, and the commitment is to peak their CO2 emission in 2030. So over the next 15 years, China will continue to increase their CO2 emission contribution till 2030, when China should start decreasing the CO2 emission contribution. This is a commitment taken during the COP21 between President Obama and President Xi, and are the signals we have in these years is that very likely China will be able to achieve this objective. In terms of soil contamination, this problem is the #1, this is the first priority as far as environmental protection is concerned, for many reasons, because decontaminating the soil is the most complex issue, since it's very complex, it needs to involve very complex technologies, takes a lot of time, the extensions are huge, and I mean the investments for making that are huge. Just for providing some number, today 20% of the total China surface is contaminated. The arable, 16% of the arable lands are contaminated, and take into account that only 19% of the total China surface is arable. Arable land lost every year about 2% of its productivity because of pollution. This is the reason, one of the reasons, because China lost food self-sufficiency a few years ago. Another example, about 12 million tons per year is the quantity of contaminated rice, with a cost of $2.5 billion US. About 80% of the fertilizers or the contaminants are inorganic, mainly from cadmium, chromium, and arsenic. So the problem is huge, and the government is very keen to tackle ideally in the very short term. Here we mentioned China lost its food self-sufficiency in about 2008, 2006, and it's a huge political problem that also the government is trying to tackle, also through a significant reform of agriculture. If we go to water, China is facing a paradox. On average, China is not scarce in water, but the water is present in the provinces where the population and industrial concentration is pretty low. You see on the left chart, the blue areas are the areas where the water is abundant, and the red ones is the areas where water is scarce. But unfortunately, the industries and the mining especially are concentrated in the northeast, where water is scarce. It means that China is planning and is constructing a huge infrastructure for transporting water from south to the north, with huge investments, and also huge investment in water treatment and water recycling. The standards we have seen over the last years are probably the most severe in the world, since in some cases even too severe for being fulfilled with the current technologies. And this is a problem that we could also discuss later on. If we take the air, that is the third priority, even though for people the perception of air is the #1 problem, but in terms of remediation, the air is the easiest one, since for avoiding the air pollution, it's just a matter of shutting down the source of pollution. The 2 or 3 most important air pollutants are concentrated in the Jingji region, I mean Beijing, Tianjin, and Hebei provinces. That on the chart on the left is the area with the red, more concentrated red. Then around Shanghai and Hangzhou, and in the north around Harbin. But the effect of this air pollution then is nationwide, that for the effect of the winds, also the south and the Dongbei, the north, is affected by the pollution. Who lives in Beijing or lives also along the Yangtze River knows very well this issue and this problem. Of course, the environment costs also are huge in terms of human health. If we take the left chart, we do see the deaths from urban air pollution concentration, and you see China, unfortunately, is very dark, since the concentration of deaths for air pollution is the highest in the world. And on the right, we do see the effect of the PM10 on the health, and how is the delayed effect of this pollution. We do see that in 2010, the morbidity and the mortality due to PM10 concentration has a delay of about 5-6 years. So the pollution of the air has a long-term effect, much more than the soil and the water. So for concluding this chapter, as we discussed, the astonishing economic growth in China has determined huge social and environmental costs. China is the highest polluter in the world, albeit its per capita contribution is still far from OECD countries. The environmental priorities in China are: first, soil; second, water; third, air. And the overall pollution has dramatic effects on human health, and China accounts the highest concentration of deaths due to air pollution. And last but not least, China pollution has also dramatic effects on food self-sufficiency. So from these snapshots, you see how the problem is really huge, also and mainly for the dimension of the country and the size of the population. So let's see what China is doing or is trying to do to tackle the environmental issues. First of all, the 13th five-year plan that has been approved last March, and after the 12th five-year plan that concluded last year, where also the environmental issues were addressed, I would say, seriously, in the 13th five-year plan is really a priority. These are some experts from President Xi when he commented the launch of the 13th five-year plan, and where he put also attention to the water consumption, energy consumption, and CO2 emissions per unit of GDP, launching the idea of having a sustainable growth, not at the cost of the environment, is addressing to an exploitation of energy and sources in a much more efficient way. He's addressing the control and prevention of pollution, and then we'll see how, and so on and so forth. Of course, we know, everybody, that European companies and also small and medium enterprises own all the technologies and know-how and capability to fulfill the huge changes that will happen during the 13th five-year plan in the energy and environmental sectors. The second key pillar for protecting the environment is the new environmental protection law that has been approved in April 2014 and entered in force in January the 1st, 2015. There are key points that qualify this law as a significant change in the approach. The first is that The economic and social development must be coordinated and harmonized with environmental protection. Second, the involvement and commitment of the whole population and NGOs to cooperate with Ministry of Environmental Protection and other authorities for addressing environmental protection issues. Then the law worsens punishments for polluters with fines that are significantly higher than investments required to reduce pollution, like it was before the 2015. Defines guidelines for punishment, also penal, in this case for organizations assigned to monitoring the environment and that do not accomplish to their role and duties. The measurements, controls and sanctions will be accounted on a daily basis and no more on an average base, since behind the average the companies continue to pollute continuously. The tariffs will be introduced for each pollutant and not only for the standard thresholds overcome. And last, the Ministry of Environment will be assigned with a more effective role to define and execute controls and monitoring. The third is the Made in China 2025. That is a big and huge program for enhancing the overall industrial base of China, for making China to become a leader in about 10 sectors. 2 of them are about energy and environmental protection, the power equipment and the low and new energy vehicles. But among the 9 strategic tasks, the focus on enforcing green manufacturing and the restructuring industries to improve efficiency and output address directly the environmental protection issues. I would go quickly, since we are short of time, to conclude this chapter summarizing that China is seriously tackling the environmental issues for both economic and social reasons. The 13th Five-Year Plan, the new environmental protection law, the COP25, the Made in China are all significant commitments in this direction. And some improvement is becoming evident, and who lives in China or in Beijing also, at least for an air pollution standpoint, is witnessing that something is changing.
Thank you, Guido. I would like to interrupt you to ask another question to the audience. We would like to ask you which industry within the energy and environmental sectors your company is operating in. We selected some options. The first one is air, water, and soil treatment. The second one is solid waste treatment and sludge treatment. The third one is renewable, so solar, wind, and hydropower. The fourth is power, heat, and fuel, and the sixth is others. So let's have a look which is the sector that is most suit you. So we're gonna give you some more seconds to vote. Okay, we have the results, and it seems that the majority of you is not really in this option we gave you, but is in other sectors. But then we have 24% that is in the renewable sector. Then we have air, water, and soil treatment, and then solid waste. Nobody in power, heat, and fuel.
Thank you, Julia. So let's go quickly to talk about the cake. The investments, as I already anticipated, in the environmental protection sector are going to be huge. We estimate that in the next 3 years, the total investment will be about 1.52 trillion US dollars, and probably this intensity will continue over the next years. It's estimated that by the end of the 13th Five-Year Plan, China would have spent about 5 trillion US dollars in environmental protection. If we include also the energy sector, we should multiply this amount to about 1.5. So it's a huge amount of money that China will invest in environment. this huge effort will be, let's say, structured through what we name the green finance system, through many instruments that China already developed or is developing, including the PPP, so the carbon market, and other instruments that China will put in place. But all these means are very complex. In the next chart, you see the structure of a financing of an ADB project, not particularly complex, but the structure is very complex. So managing and entering these mechanisms is not easy, and you have to know very well how the system works for getting also some slice of the financial facilities in China. That might be ADB or AIAB for the One Belt, One Road, or other means that national, local government will put in place. Here we describe a very simple supply chain, energy supply chain, or energy value chain and manufacturing value chain, that are the two value chain where the environmental issues comes out. And in each segment, in each of these segments, there are opportunities for the European small medium enterprise to play a key role and to grow significantly, even double-digit over the years, provided that the approach will be designed in the right way, and then we'll see how are our recommendation about that. Just for an example, this is one particular market, is the used lubricant oil market. Used lubricant oil is an hazardous waste, and the Chinese government is very concerned about this, since the pollution coming from this pollutant is really a serious problem. This is just the market, how it works, and we designed this market. It took a lot of time, and now these numbers are the official figures of the Ministry of Environmental Protection. This is the only way for companies working in this sector to understand where to play and how to play. Without this picture, this is an example again, it's going to be almost impossible to play in a significant and successful way in China. Also, the organization beyond each sector are very complex. This is the structure of the government bodies around water management, both at national level and local level. And if you work in the water treatment, you have to deal, of course, with not all of them, but with many of them. You have to get interface, and you have to know how the system works. So we talked about the good news, about a huge amount of money, but on the left I described the market potential. It's a pyramid with many geographies, and we typically, and very simplistically, we segment the market in three slices. The big slice, what we name good enough, is a segment of the market that almost inaccessible for European small medium enterprises. It's something where the Chinese play, and it's almost possible to enter. A second segment that we name very good and reliable is a big slice where the multinationals can play, since you have to have the muscle to play there. And there is the top of the pyramid where that we name superior and unique, where the small medium enterprise can play with success. It's a big market, provided that China is a huge market, so also the 15%, 20% of the total market is a huge market where our small medium enterprise can play. So, for going then to the recommendation, China is going to invest a huge amount of money, as we said. The finance mechanisms are already in place. Each energy and environmental sector or segment is extremely articulated and complex. Although opportunities are huge, small medium enterprises can play only in the niches, or almost only in the niches that have to be very well identified, selected, and structured with a very clear value proposition. So, do's and don'ts. China is for everybody, but not everybody is ready for China. Albeit everybody can get the right preparation. So our recommendation is that to catch the opportunity in China is mandatory to approach the market in the most appropriate, planned, conscious, mature, and engineered way. China is not an opportunistic market. China is a marathon and is not a sprint. The right enthusiasm for the opportunities must be balanced with the barriers to tackle China that normally are for SMEs, but not only, a superficial understanding of the market dynamics, an incomplete and only broad understanding of legislation, lack of identification of the most proper positioning, solutions that product or services that don't match the market, or burdens to reach the customer from a geography or channel standpoint, and the strong competition both with Chinese and other international companies. The approach of I have my best product or service in the world, why the client don't buy it, cannot work. So the open air market cannot work. In China, only a well-structured approach, and I use the Volkswagen example since I didn't want to use an Italian one. I could have, but I prefer to have a very clear European example where Volkswagen started in 1983, suffering a lot when they entered, but now China is for Volkswagen the #1 market in the world, and Volkswagen approached China in the very right way for being successful. The typical approach the small medium enterprise have in China should be is not suitable for success. So coming to exhibitions, meeting the people and Chinese potential partners that promises everything, proposing distribution, etc., doesn't work. At best, the growth will be flat. In some cases, you could lose your technology, your brand, your logo, since someone else will register it. Our suggestion is a well-structured approach where the first thing you have to do is to protect your intellectual property. I mean, the logo, the brand, the technology, the patent, everything as a first step before you come to China, and then start to carry out a very deep market understanding in your sector, defining your value proposition. That is not the value proposition that you have in Europe, but the value proposition designed for China. Then design your business model through partnership or direct investment, or investment doesn't mean necessarily production investment. Also, a commercial presence is an investment for covering the marketing directly in China. Then designing a thorough and comprehensive business plan, having a step-by-step approach, a very patient approach, expecting a gradual growth and not an astonishing growth in just a few months or years, and having a short, medium, and long-term planned success. This is the way that would imply an investment at the beginning, but for sure we shorten the time of development, and for sure we reduce the risk of playing in a very complex market like China. So, is China suitable for European SMEs in energy and environmental protection sectors? The answer is yes, definitively, but I recommend to have a medium long-term vision, a very strong determination and intention to invest for at least 2-3 years. Study the market first, identify the proper niche, define the most promising value proposition for the product service you propose, define a sharp strategy, and conceive a medium long-term business master plan. Build and cultivate strong relationship at any level, especially with government. Assign top management owner of the company to launch the entry, not junior or new higher or middle management that would really suffer to launch a new business in China. Drive the partner, if any, and define priorities, and don't be driven by the partner, if any. This is one of the biggest mistakes that European small medium enterprise do. And last but not least, use delegations and participation to exhibition only as a promotion activities within a very well conceived and established strategy, and not as a starting point. So, the very conclusion. Again, China is for everybody, but not everybody is ready for China, albeit everybody can get the right preparation. China offers huge opportunities to small medium enterprises in the sectors we discussed, but for catching them it's mandatory to have a very well-structured approach. Opportunistic, superficial, distracting and short-term approaches cannot be successful in China, and China is definitely suitable for European small medium enterprises, provided that a medium long-term approach is adopted, a well-conceived plan is designed and implemented, and the right business model is conceived and executed. To fight organization will be the right organization will be deployed. Julia, I've concluded.
Thank you, Guido, for your super interesting presentation. Let's open the Q&A session now. We have a first question from the audience, so is regarding the the trend and the perspective of the Chinese investment in this sector, so the energy environmental sector in Europe. So can you talk about...
Yes, thank you, Julia. Yeah, that's a very good question. Definitely, yes. China needs innovation, needs technology in the energy and environmental protection sectors. So the traditional way of acquiring the know-how through the traditional model of technology transfer, know-how transfer is not sufficient for running and growing in this sector like China needs. So now the new trend is the Chinese companies are looking for investments to be done in European small medium enterprise, but also big enterprises, like happened in the recent past in Europe, for partnership, joint ventures, or acquisition of the majority in a model that is becoming very mature. So not only for destroying or for transferring the know-how from Europe to China, but also to take the benefit of the cash flow provided and generated by these companies, and in the medium term then acquiring the know-how to be then deployed in China for tackling the environmental protection and energy priorities that they do see in their companies in China. So this is a huge trend, and who is looking for being capitalized or for getting new resources for further growth in Europe, definitely China is a good way for getting capitals and developing partnership also in Europe and not only in China.
Thank you, Guido. We have time for another question from the audience. Is a company that is operating, is offering technologies and biomedia for the upgrading on sewage treatment plants, and they ask for where they can find more information about such projects.
Yeah, the hospitals and the biomedia and the sewage treatment. I think the sewage treatment is related to the hospitals and medical sector, and of course, yes, this is also another big sectors and very specialized niche. Where to find the information about such projects? Information and data in China are not off the shelf. Also, the available studies that you might buy off the shelf from many sources are a good starting point, but often they're not 100% reliable. So the only way of doing this is to studying China using different sources, data, information, normalizing data provided by the government that are not 100% reliable. So using multiple sources for that, and using the channels of experts and the operators, Chinese and international operators, for getting the information. So there is no single place where to get information for this project. People, and in this case, this company has to make some investment in understanding the niche where they want to play, understanding the size of the market, where is the market, what are the drivers of the market, who are the competitors, both Chinese and international, for then identifying the most proper positioning they have to have for being successful in China.
Thank you, Guido. We have time for the last question, and is one of the audience is asking for, is China looking for mature Western technologies with existing track records or also for innovative new technologies?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you to who raised this question. I would say both. And also, I mean, the Chinese companies and the Chinese sector is very diversified. So there are companies that are looking for mature technologies with a very good existing track record. I mean, a very well stable cash flow and EBITDA, has been the case of the big acquisitions that happened not only Europe but also around the world. But also, and this is what I would address for the small medium enterprises, the innovative new technologies is what is needed by the Chinese for improving and accelerating their capability to address environmental protection issues. I would say more the innovative and new technologies than established cash flow. I mean, of course, making the investments on existing track record is something that is more oriented to financial investments and to acquire the know-how for running, let's say, as business as usual plants or I mean facilities in China. I'm thinking to water treatment, for example. So it might happen. But the most interesting for the small medium enterprises are to value their very advanced innovative technology they have in the drawer, and often they don't know to have a very advanced innovative technologies that might be suitable and interesting for the Chinese.
So time is up. Thank you, Guido. Thank you very much for your participation today. If your question is not answered during the webinar, please feel free to welcome to use Ask the Expert services of the EUSME Center after the registration. We will also upload the recording and slides to the EUSME Center's website. In the end, I would like to remind you to fill the EUSME Center Service Satisfaction Survey in order to evaluate how satisfied European SMEs are and our partners are with this center's services and identify areas for future improvement. Our coordinator will send you the link to the website via panel. So look forward to see you again, and thank you again for your participation. Have a nice day.